The author identifies himself as James. Now, unfortunately, the New Testament refers to several men as James, but logic and historical fact lead us to conclude that the author is James, the half-brother of Jesus. When Peter miraculously was released from prison and went to the house of Mary, he instructed his friends to go to James and the brethren. When Paul went to Jerusalem after his conversion, he saw none of the apostles but James. Remember, James presided over the prominent Jerusalem council. The importance of the half-brother of our Lord Jesus in the church in Jerusalem meant that probably no further identification was needed. In fact, further identification could be considered a bit boastful. James is writing primarily to Jewish Christians. Now, between Pentecost and the growing persecution of them, they were dispersed from Jerusalem. These dispersed Christians had many questions. Remember, the Bible did not exist at this point. Most epistles are written to specific churches, but James is writing a universal, a Catholic epistle to all people during a time that is critical in the history of the church. Remember, Old Testament Jewish believers have come to the faith through Jesus Christ. They now know that they are living under a new dispensation, under a new covenant. But Jews were called the people of the book. They were accustomed to a text, and they had questions that needed to be answered. James, in his first chapter, deals with the way Christians should handle adversity. Jewish tradition falsely assumed that God blessed those materially in response for their holy living. Conversely, those who did evil would experience divine discipline. James is writing to them and to us to expect adversity, he says. Consider it nothing but joy when, he didn't say if, he said when you fall into all sorts of trials. He informs us that these trials come in many different forms: financial, health, family, disasters. But when we encounter these trials, we are to wholeheartedly rejoice in them, knowing that God has sent them into our lives as a part of His sanctifying us and testing our faith. James wants us to look at adversity as a way of learning and growing. Now, James assumes that everyone has deficiencies in wisdom. If ever there is a time when we lack wisdom, it is apparently in the midst of adversity. We need divine wisdom in order to assess the situation and determine the right response for us to take. It is the kind of wisdom that God promises, but we've got to ask for it. Now, here James is encouraging us to pray for wisdom by assuring us that God will grant us our wisdom without shaming or humiliating us. I remember there used to be a commercial saying there's always time for Jell-O. Well, wisdom is like Jell-O. There's always a good time to ask God for wisdom, and God will grant us that wisdom if we are sincere in our request. James tells us to ask boldly, believing without doubtful thoughts. People with doubt in their prayers are like wind-whipped waves. They can go in any direction, and if God gave them the wisdom, they could use it for good or bad because they don't have a firm hold to their faith. They are adrift at sea. God will prepare us if we are firmly a part of His army, if we're not looking back to see if we should jump ship. We don't give up our traditions easily. So remember, Jewish tradition equated wealth with piety and poverty with being wicked. Now, James is challenging them to rethink tradition. He says that the poor are rich and the rich are poor. Now, he's not advocating a redistribution of wealth in some Marxian kind of way, but he is saying that in the church, the distinctions are different. In the world, we give status to those who are rich and famous, and we think of the poor as insignificant. In the church, we are saying that the poor get the experience of developing their faith through their adversity, and those who are rich don't get that same experience, and they are not strengthened by adversity. In James's view, the church should be an institution free of systemic classism that gives the rich advantage while pushing back and down the poor. The poor can rejoice in their trials as they become rich in faith. James recognizes that there are going to be rich believers and poor believers, but both should respond to their circumstances in a godly manner. The notion that pious and prosperous link hand to hand and wicked and suffering link hand to hand must be abandoned in the New Testament. After all, Jesus said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven." James reminds all of us that riches and things of this earth are temporary. True riches are not earthly riches, but heavenly riches. If true riches are heavenly riches, then our earthly demise opens the door to our true riches. And it should not just be poor people who want relief from this life so that they can go into heaven to receive their riches. It should be rich people who want relief so that they can go to heaven. That's the lesson for this week. Oh, and I want to say happy birthday to my twin and encourager by another mother, Reggie. Have a great week. Bye.